Hi there, John Wilkinson here and History Made Easier. In explaining the result of a war, there is a need to look at both sides. What advantages one side had, or what they got right, and the disadvantages of the other side, or what they got wrong. In my simple mind, I call it the attack and defense approach to history. A goal is scored. What did the attacking team do that was brilliant? What did the defending team do that was so bad? Well, so with wars, and so with World War I. If anyone was likely to win the war quickly, it was Germany. They had the best army. They were always going to be very quick to mobilize. And they had a plan, the Schlieffen Plan. But though it was the only way they could win the war, it was still a risky plan. Its success rested on three things: that Russia would be slow to mobilize, that France would be defeated quickly in just 6 weeks, which would require German forces to attack France through Belgium, enabling it to attack the French forces from behind their defensive fortifications, taking Paris in the process. The problems were that Russia had built railways and had put plans in place to mobilize much more quickly than had been the case in the past. This required Germany to divert troops to the Russian front, weakening its assault on the French. In fact, the Germans would be held up in Belgium as the Belgians mounted a fierce defense of their country. Also, because Belgium's neutrality had been declared in an international treaty, a treaty the Germans had signed, Britain entered the war. So the Germans couldn't easily get through first the Belgian and then the British lines and swing around Paris as they had planned. And they were stopped by the French before they reached Paris in a frontal attack. And that's pretty much where the war in the West remained for the next 4 years. So the war developed into a war of attrition, a war in which victory is not necessarily the goal, rather wearing down the enemy until it is no longer able to carry on fighting. This meant that the longer the war went on, the greater the advantage Britain and France held. Britain and France, with their empires and helped by America, could draw on greater reserves of manpower, as well as materials, so that in a long drawn-out war, Britain and France held the advantage. This meant that all the battles that you see marked on the map on this slide, and so many others, wore down the ability for Germany to keep fighting, none more so than at Verdun and the Somme, and on the Eastern Front in the Brusilov offensive that the Russians launched against Austria-Hungary. Because as you see from this slide, the Entente powers and their allies, notably Italy and America, were able to mobilize many more men than the Central Powers, essentially Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And they had a huge population from which to draw from compared to the Central Powers, which would also help on the home fronts where the weapons of war were made. And so the number of casualties, though higher with regard to the Entente powers, mattered much more for the Central Powers. I hope you see the significance of this. Also, Britain was able to blockade Germany, whilst Germany's attempts to do likewise by use of its U-boats brought America into the war. So the war at sea was extremely important. It led to German, Austrian, and Hungarian citizens suffering tremendous hardships. The Germans called it the hunger blockade, as hundreds of thousands died as a result of the desperate shortage of food. And so Germany asked for an armistice, and the war was brought to an end. And you see the three factors I feel explains victory and defeat. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan, leaving Germany fighting a war on two fronts and fighting a war of attrition, the numbers of men and resources available to each side, and the war at sea, something I'll go into in more detail in a future presentation. But for now, as always, I do thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out my History Made Easier website. Cheers.